The bread was still warm when she pressed it into his hands. Maisie had not planned to stop. She never did. Not anymore. Not since the village of Dunmore had made it perfectly clear that a woman without a pack, without a mate, without even the faintest thread of wolf blood in her veins, was better off invisible. She had learned to walk close to walls, to keep her eyes low, to buy what she needed at the market, and leave before anyone found reason to remind her of what she lacked. But the old man was sitting at the corner of the grain lane with his back against the stone wall, his hood pulled low against the morning cold, and something about the stillness of him stopped her feet before her mind could object. He was not begging. That was the first thing she noticed. There was no open palm, no hollow gaze tracking passers-by for coins. He simply sat, as though the cold cobblestones beneath him were perfectly acceptable, as though the gray November sky above Dunmore was exactly what he had chosen for his morning. His cloak was dark and worn at the hem, his boots cracked at the toe, and his broad shoulders, too broad, she thought, for a man so old, were drawn inward as if he were carrying something invisible across them. Maisie looked down at the wrapped loaf in her hands. She had bought 2. She always bought 2, a habit from the years when her brother Edric had still been home, when the small house at the edge of the village had smelled of wood smoke and laughter, and her mother's dried lavender hanging above the door. 1 loaf for the morning, 1 for the evening. She had never stopped buying 2, even though Edric had been gone for nearly 3 years now, and the evening loaf always went stale. She crossed the lane before she could think better of it. Here. She held out the second loaf, still wrapped in its linen cloth. It is barley and rosemary. The baker near the eastern gate makes it well. The old man lifted his head. His eyes, she thought, were wrong. Not wrong in any way she could immediately name. They were dark, nearly black at first, but the morning light caught them strangely, and she saw something beneath the surface, something that moved like deep water. His face was lined, yes, weathered and dusted with gray stubble, and yet the bones beneath it were sharp and deliberate, as though they had been carved with a purpose she did not fully understand. He looked at the bread. He looked at her. And he did not reach for it at once, which startled her, because every hungry man she had ever offered something to had reached immediately. "You do not know me," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. It did not match the worn cloak or the cracked boots. "No," Maisie agreed, "but you look cold, and I have more than I need." A pause. Then he took the bread from her hands, carefully, as if the gesture itself carried weight he was choosing to honor. "Thank you," he said. Just that. She nodded and turned to go, pulling her gray wool cloak tighter against the wind that came sweeping down from the northern hills. The market behind her was alive with noise, the clank of iron from the smithy, the creak of cartwheels on stone, the sharp calls of merchants naming their prices. Dunmore was a border village, wedged between the Ashvale Pack's eastern territory and the great road that led north to the royal capital of Caervon. Trade moved through it like a river, and with it came all manner of travelers and dangers, and Maisie had learned long ago to keep her head down and let both pass her by. She had almost reached the end of the lane when she heard it. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the soft, sharp exchange of 2 voices she recognized, coming from behind the wool merchant's stall where the canvas overhang created a pocket of shadow and privacy. She recognized them because she heard them every evening through the thin wall that separated her rented room from the landlord's private quarters. The voice of her landlord, Gregor, and the voice of someone she had not expected, her cousin, Petra. Maisie slowed without meaning to. She told herself she would not stop. She told herself it was nothing. Petra knew half the village. Petra was always somewhere she was not expected. But then she heard her own name, said in a tone that made her skin go cold despite the wool at her shoulders. "She still has no idea about the deed, does she?" Gregor's voice lower. "None. She thinks her father's land went with the debt. She doesn't know I kept the original document." "And the brother?" "Edric is not coming back. I made certain of that 3 years ago. The market sounds continued around her. A child laughed somewhere near the butcher's stall. A horse shook its bridle. The world kept moving with complete indifference, while Maisie stood motionless in the middle of the grain lane, her remaining loaf pressed against her chest, her heart no longer beating in any rhythm she recognized. I made certain of that. 3 years. Edric had left. She had always believed he had left. Packed what little he owned, and gone north to find work in the capital. Because that was what Gregor had told her. That was what Petra had confirmed with sad, sympathetic eyes. He wanted a different life, Maisie. You know how young men are. He loves you, but he needed to go. She had grieved it. She had forgiven it. She had built an entire quiet life around the wound of it. I made certain of that. Her feet moved before she had decided anything. She turned away from the voices and walked, not running, because running drew eyes, and she needed no eyes on her right now. Back through the market, past the grain stalls, past the smithy, toward the eastern gate and the road and the cold open air beyond the village walls. She did not know where she was going. She only knew that every truth she had arranged herself around for 3 years had just cracked open beneath her feet. And if she stood still for one more moment, she would fall straight through. The road beyond the eastern gate was empty in the gray morning, stretching north between bare-limbed trees, whose branches crossed overhead like the ribs of something long dead. Maisie walked until the village sounds faded, until there was only wind and the crunch of frost beneath her boots, and the sound of her own breathing, which was coming too fast and too shallow, and she knew it. He didn't leave. Gregor did something to him. Gregor kept the deed. Her father's land. The small parcel at the edge of the Ashvale forest that had been in her family for 2 generations. That her father had loved more than anything. That she had surrendered. She had surrendered it willingly, because Gregor had shown her the debt documents and told her there was no choice. And she had believed him because she had been 22 years old, and alone, and grieving her mother, and Petra had been there nodding with those sad, helpful eyes. A sound behind her. Footsteps, deliberate and unhurried on the frozen road. She spun. The old man from the market was walking toward her. He moved, she noticed, with a strange, distant clarity, nothing like an old man. His stride was even and measured and very calm, and he was watching her with those wrong, too deep eyes, and he still held the barley loaf in his hands. "You heard something," he said. It was not a question. Maisie straightened. Everything in her screamed to run, but her legs had gone to stone. "Who are you?" He stopped a few paces from her. The wind moved his dark cloak. He said nothing for a moment, only looked at her with an expression she could not name. Not pity, not curiosity. Something older and more careful than either. "Someone," he said finally, "who owes you an honest answer." He glanced back toward the village gates, and something shifted in his posture. A subtle realignment, as though a weight he had been deliberately carrying had been set aside. But not here, and not yet. That is not reassuring. "No," he agreed. "It is not." He looked at her again, and this time she felt it. Something in the air between them, faint and strange, like the pressure before a storm breaks. "But you are standing on an empty road in the cold, with nowhere to go, and something terrible just walked into your understanding of your own life. So perhaps reassurance is not what either of us should be concerned with right now." Maisie stared at him. He held out the bread. "You should eat," he said. "Whatever comes next, you will need to think clearly." She did not take the bread, but she did not run either. And that, she would later understand, was where everything truly began. She did not eat the bread. But she walked beside him, which surprised her more than anything else that morning had produced. There was no logical reason for it. He was a stranger, old and worn-looking, with eyes that did not match his clothing, and a voice that did not match his posture. And Maisie had spent 3 years learning precisely which kinds of strangers to avoid. And yet something about his stillness disarmed the panic in her chest just enough that her feet followed him off the main road and onto a narrow path that curved through the bare-limbed trees toward a traveler's shelter she had not known existed. a low stone structure with a thatched roof and a door that had been recently oiled, because it opened without sound. Inside, there was a small hearth with embers still breathing, a rough-hewn table, 2 stools, and a stack of dry wood that someone had left with intention. The old man crouched at the hearth and added 2 pieces of wood without asking permission, without explaining himself, without filling the silence with the kind of anxious chatter that people used when they were pretending to be harmless. Maisie stood in the doorway. "You followed me from the market," she said. "Yes. Why?" He did not answer immediately. He watched the fire take hold of the new wood, and the orange light moved across the lines of his face and made him look, for a moment, like something between the man he was pretending to be and something else entirely. Then he said, "Because I watched you give away your last loaf of bread to a stranger with nothing to gain from it. And then I watched your face when you heard those voices, and I recognized what I saw." "And what did you see?" "Someone discovering that the ground they built their life on was never solid." He straightened, slowly, and turned to look at her. "It is a particular kind of devastation. I know it." Maisie said nothing. She came inside because the cold at her back was becoming unreasonable, and she pulled the door shut and sat on the stool farthest from him, her cloak still wrapped around her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap, with the careful stillness of a woman who was holding herself together by will alone. "My name is Maisie," she said. "You already seem to know that." "I heard your name spoken." "Then you heard everything I heard." "Yes." She looked at him directly. "Tell me what you are, because you are not simply an old traveler who happened to be sitting in the market this morning." Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite acknowledgement, but something that existed in the narrow space between them. He pulled back the hood of his cloak fully for the first time, and Maisie went very still. The gray at his temples she now saw was not age. It was ash, road dust, the deliberate dullness of someone who had applied something to his hair to alter its appearance. Beneath it, where the firelight hit most directly, the hair was dark, nearly black, thick and pulled back, with the kind of structure that did not belong to a man who slept in market corners. His face was lined, yes, but not with age, with weight, with the specific exhaustion of someone who carried more than any single person should, for longer than any single person should, without setting it down. And the eyes, dark at first glance, but in firelight, unmistakably, they were the deep blue-black of a winter sky just before dawn. Not the eyes of an old man, not the eyes of a simple traveler. Eyes that had seen councils and wars and territories spreading to every horizon, and had learned, through all of it, to reveal nothing unless they chose to. Maisie knew enough about the world she lived in to understand what kind of eyes those were. "You are a shifter," she said quietly. "Yes." "High rank." A pause. "Yes." "How high?" He held her gaze. He did not look away, did not deflect, did not perform the kind of modest hesitation that lesser men used when they wanted to soften a truth that might frighten someone. He simply said, "High enough that what you overheard this morning is not only your concern, it is mine." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees and the shelter walls absorbed it without complaint. Maisie thought about Edric. She thought about the deed. She thought about Petra's face, the softness of it, the practiced sympathy, the 3 years of careful, loving, suffocating lies. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs to stop them from trembling. "Gregor said he made certain my brother would not come back," she said. The words tasted like iron. 3 years ago, Edric did not leave on his own. "No," the man said. "I do not believe he did." "Then where is he?" "That," he said, "is what I intend to find out." She stared. "You do not even know my brother." "No, but I know Gregor of Dunmore." Something hardened in his face, brief, controlled, and gone again, like a flame touched by wind. "He has been of interest to certain authorities for some time. Not only for what he has done to you and yours. There are others. Families along the border road who have lost land, lost sons, lost records. Gregor has been dismantling the weak and the unprotected for years, and he has done it carefully enough that no single complaint ever reached far enough to matter. Maisie absorbed this. Her mind, which was a precise and orderly thing even in distress, was already sorting the information into what was useful and what was not. You came to Dunmore for him. I came to Dunmore to understand the scope of what he has built. He met her eyes. I did not expect to find someone who knew the inside of it. I did not know I knew the inside of it until this morning. No, but you do now. The fire had grown properly warm. Maisie loosened her cloak, just slightly, and looked at the man across the hearth with the careful attention she usually reserved for things she did not trust, but could not yet afford to dismiss. He was watching her in return, not with the hungry assessment she had learned to recognize and recoil from, but with a steadiness that was almost uncomfortable in its honesty, as though he was simply seeing her, exactly as she was, and had not yet decided whether that was a good or a terrible thing. You have not told me your name, she said. A beat of silence, not hesitation, something more deliberate. Roan, he said. It was not, she would later understand, entirely a lie. It was the name his mother had called him in private, before titles and territory had buried the person beneath them. But in that cold stone shelter with the fire between them, it was the truest name he was willing to offer, and she accepted it, because she had no reason yet to demand more. Roan, she repeated. And what do you propose? I propose that you tell me everything you know about Gregor. Every transaction, every document you signed, every conversation you can remember. And in return, I will use what I find to bring your brother home and restore what was taken from you. Maisie looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Everything her practical mind said warned her that this was foolish, that men who appeared from market corners with convenient purposes were not to be trusted, that she had already made the mistake once of trusting men who seemed to want to help her, that power did not offer itself freely and without cost. But Edric's face lived in her chest like a splinter she had learned to breathe around. 3 years. I made certain of that. And the land, her father's land, the deed that Gregor had hidden, the debt that had never been real. I will tell you what I know, she said, but I want something more than a promise. He raised an eyebrow, only slightly. I want to be part of whatever comes next, she said. I do not want to hand you the information and wait in a room somewhere while men decide what to do with it. Edric is my brother. That land is my family's. If there is a reckoning to be had, I intend to be present for it. The man called Roan was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with those deep winter eyes, and something in them shifted. Not surprise, exactly, but something that might have been the early shape of respect. Agreed, he said. Outside, the wind sharpened. The trees bent. And somewhere far to the north, beyond the border road and the bare hills and the long gray reach of winter, the great walls of Caervon rose above the kingdom like a crown that did not yet know the woman it was waiting for. She talked for a long time. It surprised her how much she remembered. Details she had filed away without knowing why. The exact wording Gregor had used when he presented the debt documents. The way Petra had always been present at precisely the right moments. The morning 3 years ago when Edric had supposedly said his goodbyes, but Maisie had never actually seen him leave, had only been told afterward that he was gone. She had accepted it because grief makes people accept things they would otherwise question, and she had been deep in the gray water of grief then, still raw from her mother's death, still learning how to be alone in a world that had no particular use for her. Roan listened without interrupting. That was the first thing that struck her about him, not his stillness, which she had already noted, but the quality of his attention. He did not shift on his stool or glance toward the door or let his eyes slide away when she said something that required sitting with. He simply listened, with the focused patience of someone who understood that the spaces between facts were often where the truth lived. When she finished, The fire had burned lower, and the light outside the shelter's single small window had shifted from gray morning to the pale flat white of midday. "The deed," he said. "You never saw your father's original document after the debt was presented." "No." Gregor brought his own copy. He said the original had been lodged with the village record keeper as part of the debt settlement. "And you did not think to verify that?" "I was 22, she said without apology. "My mother had been dead for 6 weeks. Petra was the only family I had left, and she was telling me it was the only way. And She stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table. "I trusted her. That is the honest answer." Roan nodded once, slowly. "The record keeper in Dunmore. Do you know him?" "Old Hendricks. He has kept the village records for 30 years. He is..." She paused. "He is Gregor's wife's uncle." Something crossed Roan's expression that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction. It was the look, she thought, of someone confirming a suspicion they had hoped was wrong. "Then the records were never honest," he said. "No." The word sat in her mouth like a stone. "Probably not." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. Then he reached beneath his worn cloak and produced something that surprised her entirely. A small leather-bound journal, slim and unmarked, with a brass clasp that caught the firelight. He opened it to a page already dense with small, precise writing, and she caught a glimpse of names, dates, locations, connected by lines drawn in dark ink, a map of something she did not yet have the full shape of. "Gregor is not working alone," Roan said. "He is one thread in something larger. There are 3 other men along the border road, landholders, minor pack officials, who have been using the same method. False debts. Forged documents. Intimidated record keepers. The land they accumulate is not being kept. It is being sold." Maisie went still. "To whom?" "That is what I have not yet been able to confirm." He closed the journal and looked at her. "But whoever is buying it is paying in quantities that suggest they want the border territory specifically, not the land itself. What the land provides: access. A corridor through pack boundaries that would allow movement without the knowledge of any single alpha." The implication settled over her slowly, the way cold water entered through wool. "Someone is building a route," she said, "through territory that should be impassable." "Yes. For what purpose?" "That is the question that brought me to Dunmore." He looked at her steadily. "And your father's land sits at the precise center of that corridor." Maisie thought about the small parcel at the edge of the Ashvale forest. She had loved it as a child, the way the trees opened onto a natural ridge that let you see for miles in every direction, north toward Cairvan, east toward the Ashvale lowlands, west toward the mountain passes. Her father had called it the kingdom's open eye. He had meant it as poetry. It had apparently been geography. "They killed my father for land," she said. Her voice was very quiet and very level. Roan looked at her carefully. "Your father's death, what were you told?" "Fever. He had been ill for months before. The healer said it was a wasting sickness." She paused. Gregor helped arrange the burial. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Maisie stood abruptly. She moved to the small window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the bare winter trees, because she needed a moment where no one could see her face. Her father. Not fever. Not a wasting sickness that took him slowly and cruelly over months. Something deliberate. Something arranged. Something that Gregor had stood at the graveside of and nodded over with the solemn face of a helpful neighbor. She breathed. In and out. The frost on the window glass blurred and cleared. She had learned, in the years since her mother died, that grief did not always arrive as tears. Sometimes it arrived as a hard, cold clarity, a sudden sharpening of everything she had been seeing through gauze, every soft explanation snapping into focus as the lie it had always been. She felt that now, not breaking, crystallizing. When she turned back, her eyes were dry and her jaw was set. "I need to get into Gregor's private records," she said. His personal ledger. If he has been selling the land, there will be a buyer's mark somewhere, a seal, a name. He would not trust something that valuable to memory alone. Roan looked at her with those winter eyes. You are proposing to go back into the village. I am proposing to go back into his house. She held his gaze. I still have a room there. He does not know I heard anything. If I return before midday as I always do, he will have no reason to suspect. It is dangerous. Yes. If he realizes what you are doing, then I will need you to be nearby. She said it simply, as a logistical statement, not a plea. She watched something shift in his expression. That same quality she had seen before in the market, the specific attention of someone encountering something that required a reassessment. You are remarkably composed, he said, for someone whose world came apart this morning. My world came apart 3 years ago, she said. I simply did not know it until today. Today I am just catching up to the truth. She pulled her cloak back over her shoulders and straightened the gray wool with deliberate hands. Will you be nearby or not? A pause that lasted exactly long enough for her to understand that he was not accustomed to being asked direct questions by women in worn linen dresses standing in travelers' shelters. Yes, he said. Good. She moved toward the door, then stopped, looked back at him over her shoulder. Roan, whatever rank you actually are, and I know it is higher than you have told me, when this is over, I expect the full truth of it. He said nothing, but his eyes did not look away. And in the firelight, just for a moment, something very old and very deliberate moved through them. Something that was not the expression of a man who had been recognized and was frightened by it. It was the expression of a man who had been recognized and was, despite everything, quietly relieved. Maisie walked out into the winter cold and turned toward Dunmore. She did not look back again. But she heard his footsteps behind her, steady and unhurried, keeping pace at a careful distance, present without crowding, close without imposing, like a shadow that had decided to be useful. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she did not care who he was, or what weight those eyes carried, or why his voice had the quality of someone accustomed to rooms that fell silent when he entered them. She told herself all of this very firmly. It did not entirely work. Gregor's house was a broad, timber-framed building on the Merchants' Row, 3 stories with a carved door and window boxes that were empty now in winter. Maisie entered through the side gate as she always did, climbed the back stairs to her room, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed for exactly 3 minutes, counting her breaths, steadying her hands. Then she rose, smoothed her dress, and went to find the one place in the house Gregor had told her she was never to enter, his study, ground floor, the room with the iron lock and the door that smelled, always, faintly of tallow candles and old secrets. The lock, as it happened, yielded to the thin iron pin she kept in her braid for mending torn hems. Her hands did not shake at all. The study smelled of tallow and cedar wood, and something underneath both that she could not name. Something faintly chemical, like herbs burned past their purpose. The single window was shuttered, and the only light came through the gaps in the wood, thin blades of pale winter gray that cut across the room in silence. Maisie did not light a candle. She worked by instinct and the faint light available, moving to the large oak desk that dominated the center of the room with the careful steps of someone who understood that speed and noise were enemies. The desktop was ordered with the particular tidiness of a man who wanted to project trustworthiness. A ledger open to a benign page of household accounts, an ink pot, a tray of blank correspondence parchment, a candle stub. Nothing that would alarm a casual observer. She did not look at the desktop. She looked at the floor. Her father had kept a private ledger too, when she was small. He had kept it not in his desk, but beneath the loose board under the left corner of his chair, because he had said once that the most important things in a man's study were the things he pretended not to need access to. She had been perhaps 9 years old when he said it, and she had remembered it the way children remember things spoken by people they love. Not because she understood it then, but because the tone of it told her it mattered. She moved Gregor's chair. The board beneath the left corner was not loose, but the one beneath the right corner was, and when she pressed it at the near edge, it tilted up with a soft, betraying creak that made her freeze for 3 full seconds, listening. The house was quiet. Midday. Gregor would be at the merchant's hall for another hour at least. She reached into the space beneath the board. 2 items. A rolled document tied with a red cord, the kind of cord used on legal instruments in the kingdom's eastern territories, and a small iron box with a simple latch. She took both to the desk, where the light was marginally better, and unrolled the document first. Her father's name was at the top. Aldrich Vane, written in his own hand on the original deed of land grant, stamped with the seal of the Ashvale Territory Recorder, and dated 26 years prior. Below it, added in different ink and a different hand entirely, was a line of text she had never seen. Transferred in settlement of debt, witnessed and sealed. G. Morath, licensed creditor of Dunmore, the 14th day of the frost month. G. Morath, Gregor's full family name. The witness seal beneath it was Hendricks, the record-keeper's mark, pressed there as evidence of legitimacy, transforming a document that had been stolen into one that appeared lawful. She breathed through her nose, slowly. Set the deed down. Opened the iron box. Inside, a folded letter, a small leather purse that clinked softly with coin, and a second document, this one bearing a seal she did not recognize at first. A circle of pressed black wax stamped with the shape of a broken antler. She stared at it for a long moment, before the recognition arrived, cold and nauseating. The Moravelle sigil. She knew that name. Everyone along the border road knew that name, the way they knew the names of storms, not from direct experience but from what was left after. Lord Cavan Moravelle, Northern noble. Officially a trading partner of 3 border packs. Unofficially, the subject of whispers that never quite became accusations. Disputes over territory boundaries. Pack members who had spoken against him and later gone silent. An alliance with the crown that had mysteriously never been formally recorded. She unfolded the letter. It was brief. The handwriting was precise and cold, the kind of script produced by someone who dictated to scribes but had, on this occasion, chosen to write personally, which meant the contents were not meant to be known by anyone other than the recipient. The corridor must be complete before the Winter Council. The Vane parcel is the last obstruction. Resolve it cleanly and the remaining payment will follow. The boy was an unnecessary complication. He is dealt with, but kept alive as leverage should the girl become troublesome. Do not let her become troublesome. The boy. Edric. Maisie read the line 3 times. Each time it landed differently. First as information, then as relief so violent it made her dizzy, then as fury so clean and cold it was almost indistinguishable from calm. Edric was alive, kept as leverage, which meant he was somewhere, held somewhere, by someone connected to Moravelle, which meant either Gregor knew the location, or the letter contained a clue she had not yet found. She turned it over. On the reverse, in the same precise hand, a single line, the Ashvale Holding, Eastern Tower. Warden answers to my seal. She folded the letter, placed it inside her dress, pressed flat against her ribs, rolled the original deed and tucked it into the same place. Left the iron box exactly as she had found it, purse and blank second document arranged as before, and replaced the false bottom board and the chair with the care of someone who understood that the difference between discovery and survival was often a matter of 2 inches and a slightly tilted chair leg. She was back in the corridor with the study door locked behind her inside of 12 minutes. Her hands were trembling now. She noticed them distantly, the way one noticed weather from indoors. Present, relevant, but not immediately threatening. She pressed them flat against the stone wall of the corridor, and closed her eyes, and let herself have exactly 30 seconds of trembling, because Edric was alive, and she had the deed and she had the letter, and 30 seconds of trembling seemed like a reasonable price for all of that. Then she straightened, smoothed her dress, walked out through the back of the house into the cold afternoon. Roan was leaning against the garden wall 20 paces from the gate, still in the worn cloak, still carrying the patient stillness of someone who understood how to wait without making waiting look like waiting. His eyes found her immediately, and something in them changed. A quick, careful assessment that moved from her face to her hands to her posture and back to her face. "You found something," he said. "I found everything." She stopped in front of him and lowered her voice to just above the wind. "Edric is alive. Moravelle has him in the Ashvale Eastern Holding. The land corridor was Moravelle's plan from the beginning. Gregor was only his instrument." She paused. "And I have the original deed and the letter that proves all of it." Something happened to Roan's face that she had not seen before. The controlled stillness cracked, just slightly, not dramatically, not with any performance of emotion, but in the way a stone face shows a fracture when examined closely in good light. His jaw tightened. His eyes, already dark, went darker. "Moravelle," he said. The word came out flat and quiet, the way words did when they were being held back from becoming something larger. "You know him." "Yes." His voice was entirely even. "I know him." "Then you know what this means. If he is building a corridor through border territory without pack authority, without council record." "It means he intends to move something," Roan said, "or someone, in significant number, through territory that no alpha in this kingdom has sanctioned." He looked at her. "This is not a land dispute, Maisie. This is preparation for something considerably worse." She held his gaze. "All the more reason to move quickly. Edric is in that eastern tower. If Moravelle realizes the letter is missing—" "He will not realize it today," Roan said, with a certainty that surprised her. "Gregor does not report to him daily, but we have perhaps 2 days before the absence of contact raises concern." He straightened from the wall, and again she noticed it, the way the worn cloak could not quite disguise the quality of the movement beneath it, the authority in the set of his shoulders that had nothing to do with age or travel dust. "I need to send word ahead. There are men I trust positioned 2 hours north of here." "Your men," she said carefully. "Yes." "How many men does a traveler named Roan keep 2 hours north of a border village?" He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression, the same quality she had seen in the shelter by the fire, that sense of a decision being approached from a great and considered distance. "Maisie," he said, "when this is resolved, when your brother is safe and the deed is restored, and the truth of what Moravelle has built is laid before those who have the power to answer it, I will tell you everything. I give you my word." "Your word," she repeated. "I do not yet know what your word is worth." "No," he agreed. "You do not. But you know what I have done this morning, which is stay when I had no obligation to, listen when I had no particular reason to, and stand against a wall in the cold for 40 minutes while you did something extremely dangerous without asking me to simply handle it for you." He met her eyes directly. "Judge the word by what it accompanies." Maisie looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she said, 2 days. Send your word north, and tomorrow at first light we go to the Ashvale Holding." He nodded once. "There is one more thing," she said. She reached into her dress and produced not the deed or the letter, but something she had taken from the iron box that she had not mentioned yet. A small bronze token, circular, stamped on one face with the broken antler of Moravelle, and on the other with a number. 7. I believe this is a key of passage. Whoever carries it can enter the Ashvale Holding without question. It matches the warden's seal on the letter. Roan stared at the token in her palm. Then he looked at her face. Then, quietly and without any performance of it whatsoever, he said, "You are remarkable." Maisie closed her fingers around the token and put it back inside her dress. "I am practical," she said. "There is a difference." She turned toward the road. "I will meet you at the shelter at dawn. Do not be late." She walked away before he could respond. But she heard him. just at the edge of the wind, a breath of sound, low and quiet, the kind that is not meant to be heard. It was not quite a laugh. It was something more private than that. She told herself it did not matter. Her heart told her something else entirely, and she was too tired and too full of documents pressed against her ribs to argue with it tonight. Dawn came in pale and soundless over Dunmore, the kind of morning that withheld even the small comfort of color, just gray sky pressing down on gray frost, and the road north stretching ahead like a seam in cloth that had been pulled too tight. Maisie was at the shelter before Roan. She had not slept. She had lain on her narrow bed in Gregor's house, listening to the silence of the building around her and thinking about her father, who had loved a piece of land enough to record its deed in his own hand, and about Edric, who had been taken in the night and made to disappear so cleanly that she had spent 3 years grieving a departure that had never happened. She had thought about all of it, with the quiet, methodical attention she gave to things that could not be changed, cataloging them, not to make peace with them, but to make certain she remembered every detail clearly when the moment came to use them. Roan arrived 7 minutes after her. He was not alone. 2 men came with him, both large, both wearing the kind of unremarkable traveling cloaks that were designed to discourage a second look, and both moving with the disciplined ease of trained fighters who were working hard not to look like trained fighters. They stopped at the tree line and went no further, which told her Roan had instructed them to stay back. He came to the shelter door alone. He looked different in the early light, or perhaps she was simply seeing him more clearly now. The ash gone from his hair, washed out or combed through, so that the black of it showed fully, thick and pulled back, with the several narrow braids at his temple that she had not noticed before. His jaw was clean of the gray dust that had aged him in the market. He was wearing the same leather and the same dark cloak, but without the deliberate stoop and the slow step. He was simply himself, and himself was considerably more arresting than the old man he had been performing. He was, she estimated with the same practical eye she applied to most things, somewhere in his mid-30s. He was also, undeniably, the kind of man that rooms reorganized themselves around, not because of beauty, though he had that too, in the sharp-boned, serious way of someone who had never particularly needed it, but because of the quality of his presence, the absolute certainty of it, the sense that the air nearest to him had simply decided to behave. She did not say any of this. "You cleaned the ash from your hair," she said. "There seemed little point in the disguise now," he said, "and your men at the tree line. They will follow at a distance. If we meet resistance at the holding, they will come forward. If we do not, they will remain unseen." He looked at her steadily. "I would prefer you stayed behind them. You agreed yesterday. I agreed you would be part of what came next. I did not agree to place you in the path of Moravel's warden without a plan." He reached into his cloak and produced a second bronze token, identical to hers except stamped with the number 3. "We enter together. We find your brother. We take him out before any alarm is raised. If the warden challenges us, the tokens buy us time. If they do not buy us enough time," he paused, "then I will handle what remains." The certainty in his voice was not bravado. It was the flat, factual confidence of someone who had handled things before and found the experience entirely manageable. She had heard men perform courage her entire life. This was not performance. This was simply a man telling her what would happen because he had decided it would. She should have found it presumptuous. She found it instead the most stabilizing thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. "Then we go," she said. The Ashvale Eastern Holding was 2 hours north and 1 hour east, through forest that grew denser and older as they moved away from the border road. The trees here were pine and black oak, and the ground beneath them was needled and silent, swallowing the sound of footsteps, so that the world reduced to cold breath and the crack of occasional frost underfoot, and the distant call of a single crow that seemed to be following them with mild, judgmental interest. Roan walked beside her. Not ahead, beside. She noticed it without remarking on it. Halfway through the forest, he said quietly, Your father built the deed clause himself, did he not? The wording on the original document, to remain within the vein line by blood, not by transfer. That clause makes the forged transfer legally void under pack law. She glanced at him. You read it that quickly. I read quickly. A pause. He was protecting you. He knew the land's value and he built a legal barrier into the original document. Gregor could not have legally transferred it even if the debt had been real. Something tightened in her chest. Her father, ill and dying, still thinking 3 moves ahead, still trying to keep something safe for her. Then when this goes before the council, the land returns to you, he said, without negotiation. The clause makes it absolute. She was quiet for a moment. The pines moved overhead. You said the council. Which council? He did not answer immediately. Roan. The king's council, he said. In Caervan. The way he said it, the king's council, was the way a man said my house without meaning to. The easy familiarity of ownership that could not be entirely suppressed, even when one was trying. Maisie stopped walking. He stopped a half pace ahead of her and turned. She looked at him. The braided black hair, the winter blue eyes, the quiet authority that had been present from the first moment in the market, and that she had been cataloging and filing away and deliberately not thinking too hard about. Roman, she said. Not a question. The name had come to her in the night, surfacing from the fragments of knowledge that circulated even in border villages. The Alpha King who had taken the throne 8 years ago, who was said to travel in disguise through his own kingdom to see it clearly, who was said to have eyes the color of deep winter and a patience that had ended 3 wars without a single unnecessary death. He held her gaze. He did not deny it. You were never just passing through, she said. No. You came to Dunmore because Moravel's plan threatened your kingdom. Yes. And I... She stopped, reorganized. The bread. You were testing the village, seeing who would stop. I was observing, he said carefully. I was not testing you specifically. I did not know you existed until you put a loaf of rosemary bread in my hands and looked at me like I was simply a person who was cold. She stared at him. That, he said quietly, is rarer than you might think, from where I stand. The forest was very still around them. The crow had gone silent. Somewhere ahead, through the thinning trees, she could see the dark outline of a stone structure, the eastern holding, squat and grim against the winter sky. There was so much she wanted to say. There was so much anger available to her, at the disguise, at the withholding, at the days she had spent talking to a man whose real name carried more power than anything in her entire known world. But the anger, when she reached for it, was softer than she expected, because she also remembered the shelter, and the fire, and the quality of his listening. She remembered Judge the word by what it accompanies. She remembered 2 hours of walking through a cold forest, beside her, not ahead. We will discuss the rest of this later, she said. After Edric. Yes, he said, simply. No relief, no gratitude, just the steady acknowledgement of a man who understood that he had not yet earned more than that. They entered the holding on the tokens. The warden, a broad, nervous man who sweated despite the cold, looked at the bronze seals and stood aside without a word, which told Maisie everything about how Moravel ran his operations. Loyalty through fear, obedience through symbol. No one beneath him knew enough to question. Edric was in the eastern tower. 3rd level. A room that was cold but not cruel. A cot, a brazier with dying coals, a water jug. He was thinner than she remembered, and he had grown a beard that made him look older, and when the door opened and he saw her face, he made a sound that had no word for it in any language. Something between a name and a prayer. She crossed the room and held her brother and did not cry, because she had decided somewhere in the pine forest that she would not spend her tears on relief when there was still work to do. She held him instead, fiercely and completely, and felt him shake against her, and said into his shoulder, very quietly, I know everything. It is over. You are coming home. What followed moved quickly, the way things do when prepared properly. Roman's men came forward from the tree line and took the holding without violence. The warden surrendered on sight of the king's seal, which Roman produced from beneath his cloak with the calm efficiency of a man returning a borrowed item. Gregor was taken from his merchant's hall in Dunmore before midday by 3 king's riders who had been stationed in the village since the previous evening. Petra, who had fled toward the eastern road at first rumor of the arrest, was intercepted at the border crossing by a 4th. Lord Cavan Moravel was summoned to Caervan by royal decree 3 days later. He arrived expecting a routine council inquiry and found instead a full tribunal, pack alphas from 4 territories, the kingdom's senior legal recorder, and a king who had spent 3 weeks traveling his own border in disguise and had seen with his own eyes the shape of what Moravel had been building. The bronze tokens, the forged deed, the letter with its precise cold handwriting, and the testimony of 6 border families whose land had been similarly seized. All of it was laid before the council in precise and irrefutable order. Moravel's titles were stripped. His holdings were seized. The corridor he had spent 4 years constructing through stolen land was dismantled. The territory returned to its rightful holders by royal decree before the Winter Council's final session closed. Edric recovered slowly, and then all at once, the way young men do, the thinness filling out, the shadows under his eyes receding, the laugh returning first quietly, and then with its full, ridiculous volume. He was given back not only his freedom, but a formal acknowledgement of wrongful imprisonment, sealed by the king's own hand, which he kept folded in his coat, and touched occasionally as though confirming it was real. The land at the edge of the Ashvale forest was restored to the Vane name in the first week of the new year. Maisie stood on the ridge her father had loved, the one that let you see for miles in every direction, on a morning when the frost had made everything precise and glittering, and she looked out at the kingdom spread below her and felt, for the first time in years, that the ground beneath her feet was exactly as solid as it appeared. Roman came and stood beside her. He had not crowded her in the weeks since the tribunal. He had given her time in Caervan, a suite of rooms that were warm and quiet, access to the king's library where she had spent several very satisfying days reading everything she could find about pack law and land rights, and the space to breathe and grieve and reorganize herself without anyone requiring anything of her. He had appeared at meals when she was present and been absent when she was not, and he had never once asked her to feel anything faster than she felt it. Now he stood beside her on her father's ridge and looked north toward Caervan, and for a while neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of conversation. "You knew," she said finally, "when you were sitting in that market corner, that you would not stay hidden much longer." "I knew the moment you handed me the bread," he said, "that something had changed. I did not know what. I only knew that it had." She turned to look at him. In the clear winter light, with no ash in his hair and no pretense in his posture, he was simply himself, serious and steady, and carrying the weight of a kingdom with the particular quietness of someone who had long since stopped expecting anyone to share it. He looked back at her, and in his eyes, those deep winter sky eyes, she saw something she had been seeing for weeks without allowing herself to name it. "I am not easy," she said. "I am practical and I am stubborn, and I require honesty in all things, and I will not be a decoration, or a consolation, or a political arrangement." "I know," he said, "and I am a human woman with no wolf blood, and no rank, and a small parcel of land on a border ridge that only matters because my father loved it." "I know that too." "Then what?" she said. "Do you want?" He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth, and the distant smoke of a village hearth. Then he said, with the same flat, factual certainty he had used in the forest when he told her what would happen and meant every word of it, "You, exactly as you are, without amendment." Maisie looked at him for a long time. She thought about bread pressed into cold hands, about a fire in a stone shelter and a man who listened without looking away, about 30 seconds of trembling against a wall and the decision to stop and stand straight, about her father's deed clause, to remain within the vein line by blood, not by transfer, and the stubborn, loving foresight of a man who had known his daughter well enough to build her a protection she would not find until she was ready for it. She thought about Edric's laugh, returned, about justice, laid in writing before a full tribunal, about the ground, solid and glittering, and hers. Then she turned back to the view. The miles of kingdom spread in every direction, precise and cold and beautiful in the winter light. And she said, simply and without ceremony, "Then stay." He did. The Winter Council named Maisie Vane a formal ward of the crown, and 3 months later, by her own choice, and with the full witness of 4 pack alphas, his queen. Edric stood at her left through the ceremony, embarrassingly emotional and completely unashamed of it. The land on the Ashvale Ridge was formally recorded in perpetuity under the Vane name, by royal decree. The deed her father had written, with its careful clause, lodged permanently in the kingdom's central archive, where no Gregor, and no Moravelle, and no convenient debt could ever reach it again. Gregor died in the king's prison 2 years later, unmourned. Petra spent the remainder of her years in a convent in the Northern Territory, which was, by all accounts, considerably more than she deserved, and considerably less than she wanted. The warden of the Ashvale holding was released after 3 years, having been judged an instrument rather than an architect, and returned to a quieter life far from any tower. And on the ridge at the edge of the Ashvale forest, on the clearest mornings when the frost made the whole kingdom glitter, a woman with a long blonde braid and a grey wool cloak stood and looked out at everything, and beside her stood a king with black braided hair and winter blue eyes, and neither of them said very much, because they had both learned, separately and then together, that the things most worth keeping did not need to be spoken aloud to be true. They simply were. And they remained.